So, hello everybody. Again, this is another session of the Bow of the Father. So, I wanted to start by addressing the question from last week, which was about the use of the word deaconess in the Bible. And so, I did some research. I posted on the last week's post on the video, so you can go back and read that if you want. But basically, what it comes down to is the nominative feminine word for deacon is never used in the most traditional translation of the Bible, including the King James. So really, there's great software I have on here called Verbum, which can do like word searches and actually looks at the original Greek and gets like text comparisons and actually looks at like church fathers and a lot of commentaries, which is really a great tool as a someone who prepares homilies on a weekly basis or daily for that matter. And I did a search for deaconess in that software that searches the NAB and the New Jerusalem and the King James and so all these different versions, and nothing came up. Now, where the confusion might be is maybe more contemporary translations may have looked at the word diakonos or diakonou and referred that to say, oh, that means deacon. And if it's referring to a woman, which is the genitive feminine, diakonou, that would be translation that deaconess. Where prior to that, all the original texts, right, actually, and even back in the Greek, would translate diakonou as servant. So when it says like Phoebe, the biggest one is like this woman Phoebe, who's found in Romans. But Paul says, Phoebe, who is also a servant. You could say because that diakonou is referring to Phoebe, it should be translated as deaconess. But nowhere in history or any edits or any translations prior to maybe like the last, 30, 40 years maybe. Because I haven't looked at those translations recently. There's a lot of translations that came out really recently, especially after Vatican II and maybe more contemporary, that may translate it that way. But before that, you would never find that, and especially the Bible is used in more liturgical use, whether it be in Protestant Bible or the Catholic Bible. So what that would lead me to believe is that maybe the translation could have been servant, and people would retranslate it to mean deaconess. But regardless, we would say that, well, our understanding handed down from tradition of what a deaconess was not an ordained position. It was an instituted position by a bishop, but it was granted for a particular ministry in the liturgy. So like we have commissioning for like extraordinary ministers, right? There's a rite associated with that. We have institution of like lectors and servers, that kind of stuff. There's a rite for that. That's not an ordained state. And so that may be where the confusion may come into play. That yeah, there were women deaconesses back in the early years of the church, but the reason behind that is because, well, men and women were baptized in the nude. And it would be very immodest for a bishop or a priest or even a deacon to be there in that in the women's area to do the anointings that are necessary and even the actual immersion that would have been done at the time. So you had instituted ministers who would do that for the women, and they called them deaconesses or servants. Now those deaconesses then over time, as that practice came out of but that tradition came out of practice, they became the first abbesses, the first canonesses, like the first sisters, right, and nuns they would have, and that would have happened around the 4th, 5th century. Okay, so be very clear about that, because I know there's been a lot of talk about that recently, and I know that came out maybe a couple years ago, and Pope Francis was looking at that again, but that's really, I think that's pretty much been exhausted as far as what that term meant and who the deaconesses were. So I think it's important to make sure that's very clear, because I think some people may be misinterpreting that, oh well, if we had in the early church and we should have deaconesses now who would do the same thing as a deacon. Well, hold on. First off, no, they didn't do the same thing back in the first years of the church. And also, what we have to look at is there a need now to have a deaconess institution, right? Well, I don't see anyone being baptized in the nude anymore. So And plus, I think it also diminishes in a way the role of sisters and nuns in the church hierarchy. You have to understand they have a very important role when it comes to the life of the church, and not only that, but the life of the ordained ministry. There's a now causation, correlation, I don't know, but it seems very interesting that whenever there's a lacking in women consecrated life, there's also a lack in the ordained life. They go hand in hand. So that's why it's very important that we actually encourage our young ladies and women to look at that as a vocation, because we need them and we also need priests. So very good. Great. Any questions about that? Any comments, concerns, heresies? Good. All right. Okay, well, let's open it up. Any other questions, comments? Also online, we got, looks like 5 people watching, so if we got any comments online, please feel free to ask them. I'll be reading them. I'll be looking over so often to take them if you have them.
I came to ask your thoughts about the motu proprio.
Yeah,
I'm sure you were expecting that and probably studied up on that. Lots of going on there.
Yep. Okay. So it's funny. It came out on Friday. The memorial of Our Lady of Mount Carmel, which is also, I understand, the anniversary of the split between the Eastern and Western Church back in 1054. So interesting that came out on that day. I don't know if that's a foreshadow of things to come, but who knows. As I said in my homily on Saturday, if the schism comes about because of this, it wouldn't be the first, so it's definitely not going to be the last. But I also think we have to look at the rationale that the Holy Father gave. So first and foremost, what he said was based on a questionnaire that was sent out to the bishops of the world to get their opinion, their thoughts about what's going on in their dioceses when it comes to the extraordinary form and the Novus Ordo. What he was appalled to find was that there's been abuses on both sides. So in other words, you have the extraordinary form, which is beautiful in its own right and has a great mysticism about it. But also there was abuses being made, which, for instance, part of the directive that came out was the 1962 Missal should be used for the extraordinary form. Well, I even know here in St. Louis, that Missal's not being used in some cases. They're using earlier versions, which is considered to be illicit. There's an attitude in some respects, and I think here in St. Louis by some people, not all, that the extraordinary form is superior to the Novus Ordo. And that's never been the intent of the fathers. That's never been the intent of Benedict or John Paul II. And it seems that it's taken something in the water that's kind of convincing people. Now, to be fair, I think it's okay to say I have a preference. There's nothing wrong with that, and people do. But I think the problem is it's been going beyond that opinion and being declared as a statement of fact that the extraordinary form is the superior rite when it's not meant to be that. But also in the Novus Ordo, there's been, as maybe we're talking about a little bit earlier, there's abuses there too, right? I mean, we've seen that over the last 50 years, that especially maybe early on after the Vatican II, there's some innovations that are being done, right? And even today, maybe some innovations being done that are not necessarily listed either. So I think the reason he's kind of settling this because he wants to make sure that that's very clear. The second point he makes, which can be debatable, but I think there's truth to it, that no other time in history when the Vatican, I should be clear, the Vatican has come out and said, this is the way we're going to do liturgy from here on out. Has there been multiple forms that come out because of that, right? You look at Pius V and Trent. When the Tridentine Mass was established, it was accepted globally. There was no new, I'm going to do the Athanasian Rite, or I'm going to do... No, it was, we're doing this universally, right? So he has a point in that. That's not to say in the Middle Ages that, there were multiple things going on based on certain regional perspectives, but it always maintained that same structure of, liturgy of the Word, liturgy of the Eucharist. Great. The way that was done may have been different in certain regions and areas, but that was kind of the gist and the basis. But Vatican II presented kind of a new understanding where we can have these two forms being celebrated not together but separately, based on preference, to try and reach up bridges to people who maybe have an affection for the Tridentine Mass and maintain that unity, right? But I think what the Holy Father was saying is that unity has been kind of disturbed because of these understandings, and not that it's the faithful's fault, but also it's the fault of the priests a lot of times, that have a preference and maybe not necessarily championing one over the other or doing these things which are not really envisioned with the Fathers of Vatican II. So because of that, he made a decision that, and this, we are very clear about what he said here, that his intention is the Novus Ordo should become the norm for the Universal Church. But he also recognizes that there's still places in the world that celebrate the Tridentine form, and even orders that's part of their charism is celebrating the Tridentine Mass. And so in order to maintain that unity and not disrupt it, he's given that faculty, I should say he's giving the power to grant that faculty to the bishops. So what that means is, like today, or should I say on Thursday, let's say, last Thursday, I could have come out at the 8 o'clock Mass and celebrate the extraordinary form by law. That was granted me the fact I'm a priest, I'm ordained, I have my faculties from the bishop. That was part of that mandate. Now, if I wanted to celebrate today, I'd have to go get that faculty from the bishop specifically to celebrate the extraordinary form. So, practically speaking, what that means for here in St. Louis, the Institute, the Oratory, places have already been celebrated as part of their right. The personal parishes are still going to have that authority to do that. But what the Holy Father was very specific in saying was that we don't want to establish any new personal parishes, right? So in other words, like St. Gabriel, we're not going to be a personal parish just to the extraordinary form. That's not going to happen anymore, right? And also his intent is to actually get the bishops to make that determination with the long-term goal of conforming everybody to the Novus Ordo. Now,
what's the extraordinary form? I don't.
That's like the Mass before 1962. So all Latin, you have like prayers for the altar. There's different specific vestments that are used, like berettas, and so if you go to if you went down to Francis of Sales, they celebrate the extraordinary form completely, right? Yeah.
Is that different than the Novus Ordo?
Yes. So the prayers, even in some cases, like the cadence is different. It's still Liturgy of the Word, Liturgy of the Eucharist, but like if you were to go to the extraordinary form down Francis of Sales, you wouldn't say anything. You would kneel most of the time. All the dialogue happens between the minister in the sanctuary and the priest, which is usually a server of the priest, or the deacon, subdeacon, depending on which level of Mass it may be. There's prayers at the foot of the altar. Like in the high Masses, they actually have a sprinkling rite. So it's much different than the Novus Ordo, but you can still see the similarities, right? And again, it's all in Latin in the extraordinary form.
Well, what's alike about them?
So the likeness would be, there's still like the Kyrie, there's still like the Gloria for those special occasions, right? There's still the epistles or the readings, there's still the gospel, right? There's still the offertory rites, and there's still the Eucharistic prayer and communion, right? The structure is still the same. But for instance, if you were going, let's say you go to the low Mass at Francis of Sales tomorrow. The priest would come out, he'd hand his bread off, he'd have his chalice put on the altar, reverence the altar, do prayers at the altar, come back down, do prayers at the foot of the altar, go back up and start the antiphon, the introit, the Father, Son, Holy Spirit, Dominus Vobiscum. They would do the Confiteor, Kyrie, have the collect, or multiple collects, depending on what's going on there. There could be more than one collect, depending on what the day may be. Then they would have the epistle reading, no responsory. Responsory actually would be done in the high Masses by the choir. They would go to the gospel. There usually is no homily, no petitions. Right into the offertory prayers, right, which is also the sanctification of everything, washing of the hands, all that good stuff. Prayer over the gifts, preface, Sanctus. The Roman canon, the Eucharistic prayer 1 is the only Eucharistic prayer used in the extraordinary form. Not 2, 3, 4, or the rest of them, just canon. followed by Our Father, other rites before communion, distribution of communion, closing rites, and then every Mass ends with the Gospel of John, chapter 1. So primarily there's similarities, you see them, but you wouldn't necessarily know what's going on because you can't necessarily also hear what's going on because a lot of the prayers are silent, right? The priest and God, right? The priest still is representing the people as the mediator between God and man. The dialogue is really just happening between the priest and the other ministers. The role of the congregation is really a role of active participation, which is an interior disposition, right? An act of spiritual sacrifice by the congregation, which is the same thing supposed to happen in the Novus Ordo, right? There's still an act of participation on the part of the faithful in both forms. One's a little more explicit, while the other one's a little more implicit. But they're still supposed to be there, right? So that's really what's happened here, is that now I cannot go out today and celebrate the extraordinary form without getting that faculty from the bishop directly. And even then, there's kind of a discussion about, well, technically I should go to Rome to get their permission and blah, blah, blah. And so it can be interpreted that the Holy Father is trying to do everything he can to make it as hard as possible to celebrate that. If that's the case or not, I don't know. One thing I would say that maybe could have helped a little bit was he mentioned that I can't remember how he phrased it, but he basically made a comment saying that it's good that we can actually have the vernacular to actually understand what's going on, which is true. I think it would have helped, though, if he would have actually also harkened back to the Church Fathers, say, from Sacrosanctum Concilium, that the intention is always to go back to the mother tongue of Latin. And that's been true for the last 50 plus years, that the catechetical nature of the Mass should be done in the vernacular so people understand what's going on. But eventually, there should be a point where you go back to the original Latin, even for the Novus Ordo, right? The current way we're doing it. And so maybe this could be an indication that that's the time. So maybe we can start introducing more Latin into the Mass on a daily, weekly basis and get to the point where we actually are doing that. I think part of that could be just the fact that, the argument could be made, well, what about people who are still learning it? What about RCIA? Or what about, our children? Well, okay, well, yeah, if I'm trying to teach the Mass to somebody, I'm not going to do it in Latin. I'll probably teach it to them in English so they can actually understand what's going on. But it shouldn't be that difficult to pick up, to at least know what's happening within the Mass after you're used to it for a while. So, I don't know. I know that Monsignor and I are going to be in discussions about that. I know I might start implementing more Latin into my Masses, just to make me maybe get used to how it really should be. But we'll see how that goes. That's more of a pastoral question than anything else.
So there was no prohibition on your saying a Novus Ordo Mass today?
None at all. I can do that right now.
I'm not suggesting that you do it right now.
No, I think it'd be reasonable to say, well, maybe maybe it might be reasonable to say start the Nomine Patri Filii Spiritus Sanctus, which is supposed to be, and then Dominus Vobiscum. Beautiful. Maybe that's a start, right? Maybe that for a month or two, see how people feel about it, and then maybe you can start adding in, like, okay, what about the Agnus Dei, right? Maybe the Sanctus. Or maybe Benedicat vos omnipotens Deus, Pater, Filius, Spiritus Sanctus, ite in pace, Deo gratias, right? Maybe that's something we can actually start doing. And then eventually maybe we'll start adding the Gloria and the Creed and all these other things that we can, or even the Eucharistic prayer, and kind of go from there, right? So I think that may be a high ideal, but I think it's reasonable to maybe start implementing that, not all at once, but over time, incrementally. I don't know, what do you guys think about that?
I'm okay. I've been known to attend some extraordinary form Masses, so as someone that came of age well after extraordinary form was commonplace, and someone who really enjoys tradition. I've always had an interest in the extraordinary form and learning more about that, and learning some Latin also.
Yeah, I think the also thing to keep in mind too is that you can still do that here in St. Louis. We have places that are still going to have that for you, so it's not like it's going to be it's not completely suppressed. So we want to be very clear about that too.
You would expect the oratory out in St. Louis, and I can't remember the name of that oratory.
Of Augustine and James, Gregory and James, Gregory and James, Gregory and Augustine.
Gregory and Augustine.
Gregory and Augustine,
We
yeah.
would expect that to continue.
I would imagine, because that's been established now as a personal parish. Yeah, so that was before that change. So they still have that faculty. So Monsignor Morse can still do it. The Institute, that's part of their charism, they can still do it. Everyone else, though, would have to go and probably get that faculty from the Archbishop. Another thing to keep in mind, these are also for public masses. So that doesn't necessarily mean that a priest can't do it on his own. Like having a, like today I had my own mass just because I have a mass schedule, right? If I'm alone, that would be, I probably could do that. But it's just for public mass that we want to make that clear.
And there was a point in Article 3 in the Motu Proprio about using the vernacular.
Right.
And interpretation would be that, in these celebrations, these readings are proclaimed in the vernacular language.
Right.
So, current state, the whole Mass is in Latin, including the readings.
Mm-hmm.
I think what this is saying is the readings also need to be in English around here.
Yeah, and I think, and even the extraordinary form allows for that though too. The readings could be in the vernacular, even in extraordinary form. Typically, they're not.
Yeah.
Right, but they could be. So that's also too the Novus Ordo. We wouldn't necessarily read the Gospel and everything in Latin, because most people probably wouldn't even understand it. Now, could we get to the point where they're in Latin? Maybe that might be way out. I think we have to start teaching Latin first, maybe, if we're actually doing that.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's definitely something that could be done. Yeah.
So this doesn't have any impact on your lauds and vespers and things like that?
No, because lauds and vespers are still using the current rite. And that's even for, there really is no extraordinary form vespers, although, and even, excuse me, even Sacrosanctum Concilium, the document from Vatican II that's talking about that, even says, yeah, hey, look, if you want to use Latin in the vespers, lauds, all this stuff, great. It really allows for that, it actually kind of champions that.
Yes.
That Latin should be maintained in those instances. So usually when I celebrate solemn vespers, solemn lauds, I'll say some certain parts in Latin, like the introductory, the dismissal, the Benedictus, the Magnificat, as well as the Our Father. And if I get my hands on it or ever think of it, I probably could try and find the Psalms and the readings, sure. But then no one will be able to follow at that point, I guess. So it'll be interesting.
All right.
Yeah, no, but the Liturgy of the Hours is still can maintain that character. There's nothing saying it can't. And it probably won't, because, like I said, Vatican II was very explicit about that.
I think the last point I have about that, and maybe it's more of an observation than a question, is the Summorum Pontificum was not that long ago.
Yeah, was it 2012? 11?
7, something like
7,
that.
that's right, it was 7. It was 7, yeah.
And then, 14 years later or so, Summorum Pontificum basically said, okay to celebrate
Right.
extraordinary form, and then 14 years later, the next pope comes around and said, no, not so much of that. So that's pretty quick in the church's
That's true, that's very, yes.
timelines.
And I think at that point, who's to say, God forbid, if Pope Francis goes on to the next life or retires or whatever it may be, right? So the next pope might come back and say, you know what my predecessor said? Nah, we're not going to do that.
Yeah.
Right?
There must have been something going on in that 14 years time that, caught some attention.
Like I said, it sounded like he was basing this on this questionnaire he sent out last year. Well, last year, maybe the year before.
Mm-hmm.
And so you could make an argument like, well, Your Holiness, is that really enough time to make a determination? Could have been more, maybe, investigation done. I don't know. I think whenever you talk about abuses, liturgical abuses, that's something that should be corrected. And how that's done, basically what it comes down to is we trust that the Holy Spirit still guides the church. And if the Holy Spirit does that, then okay, we can trust that this is for our own spiritual benefit. And I think the main drive he's trying to get at is unity.
Unity, yeah.
And he's trying to unify the church, which is that's what the Pope's supposed to do,
Yeah.
right? So good. But yeah, I think I will tell you personally, I've been struggling with prayer with a lot of this just because, like, one thing keeps on coming back to me is, well, we have all these other choices in the Novus Ordo, like we were talking about earlier, right? I mean, the readings we choose, the prayers we say, if we celebrate a saint or not, right? There's a lot of choices there. And so why couldn't this be one? I don't know. I don't think I've really answered that question sufficiently. And and my prayer comes that, what keeps on coming back in prayer is, you're a loyal son of the church, and you should do what your father tells you. And yeah, okay, I'm good with that.
Me too.
Yeah. I mean, I will say, it was just kind of funny the timing, because last month I picked up a 62 Missal and some books about trying to learn more about it. And the reason I was doing that is because I was contacted by St. Barnabas out in St. Charles, asked me a couple months ago if I'd come out and celebrate Missa Cantata, which is a sung mass for Sundays. And I had to tell the person, I was like, well, first off, I don't feel sufficiently prepared to do that. I can go learn it. I don't know how long it's going to take me, but I'd be happy to come out after I learn it more. But also, one of the big problems for me is, well, you're talking about a Sunday morning in a parish that's 45 minutes to an hour away from me. I don't know if I'll really be able to do that, but I was willing to do it, willing to learn. But now this came out, it's sort of like, well, God has little jokes, I think, on us all, so it's always kind of fun. It's good.
It's interesting you say that, because when we go to daily mass, we always look at the Laudate app on my phone, and probably one day a week, if not 2 days a week, the readings will be different than the readings that are selected.
Yeah, and that's one thing too, like, sometimes those apps, they're very helpful. They're very, they can make our lives a little more efficient. But I notice this too, like, I tend to use iBreviary for my prayers, And sometimes what I find is, especially like for certain like optional memorials, they don't include all the prayers. So it's sort of like, well, okay, like today, if I went to celebrate St. Apollinarius in my Liturgy of the Hours, if I went to maybe Laudate or to iBreviary, it wouldn't have the proper prayers and stuff. So it's like, well, then I might as well go back to my book anyway. So yeah, sometimes it can be a little different. And again, but it depends. Like today, you could use a reading for St. Apollinarius, and that may not necessarily be in those apps.
Right. Yeah.
So it kind of depends. Now, tomorrow though, and for sure Thursday, they should all be the same. So I think tomorrow is mandatory, obligatory memorial, and then of course Thursday is a feast. Good. Yeah, I was wondering if that was going to come up or not. Oh, okay. A question here. My son wants to know why Jesus is called the Nazarene when he was born in Bethlehem and lived in Capernaum. That's a good question. Well, as we know, that's true that Jesus was born in Bethlehem because he is from the tribe of Judah, which is also the line of David, where Joseph came from. But also, he lived most of his life, actually, in Nazareth. From the time he came back from Egypt, which was about 7 years old, maybe, approximately, till the time he actually started his ministry at the age of 30, he was living in, or at least his family was living in Nazareth. Now, it's interesting. I saw something on YouTube, and obviously anything you see on the internet, you want to take with a grain of salt, but I thought it was very intriguing that there's a theologian that was positing that the Lord, after he turned 13, which in the eyes of the Jewish faith is that you're a man, right? You can make your own life. Most people got married at the age of 13 or 14. So, it wasn't really uncommon for the kids to leave the nest at that age and go off and live their own life. This theologian posited that during that time, though, Jesus actually went to the Far East, like through Arabia into India, and started evangelizing people there. And he bases this on a ancient Sanskrit text that called Yeshua, which is also Jesus, right? The Aramaic form of Jesus, or Isa. That's Isha. Either way, it said that this man was going around preaching that one God, loving your neighbor, loving your enemies, the message that he was kind of promoting even in the Bible. And he was persecuted by all of the people in authority through Arabia and India, and almost to the point where he was being hunted out to be killed, especially in the Hindu areas. And then he came back, 10 years later to Nazareth, and then started his ministry then. Now, whether that's true or not, I don't know. It doesn't necessarily conflict with anything in the gospel, because a lot of those years we don't know about, right? The time we heard when he was born, went to Egypt for a little while. He turned 12 and got lost in the temple, and then for about 18 years we hear nothing, right? So it's very possible that could be the case. But the reason that they say that he's a Nazarene is also to fulfill the prophecy of Micah, right? Who says that he shall be called a Nazarene, right? And he was. He lived in Nazareth. His family line was from Nazareth. His name was Jesus of Nazareth. So that's why we can say that he was a Nazarene, because he lived there. That's what his title was, among other things. But also is a fulfillment of the prophecy of the Old Testament. Primarily, that's the main cause. But we would say that he definitely lived there for a good portion of his life. It's a good question. Great. Anything else? Pretty short session tonight. All right, great. All right, good.
I have one of my kids' question. I can send them up after Mass if you
Beautiful.
prefer.
Do you know what it is off the top of your head?
Yes.
What is it?
Where does Jesus live today?
Well,
Omnipresent?
he's omnipresent because he's God. In our hearts, we're dwellings of the Holy Spirit, the temples, right? The tabernacle is another place. I think it's important to recognize when we talk about the presence of God, we have to actually describe and make a determination in which way are we talking about. So bodily, physically, well, he's in heaven, right? Heaven is not necessarily a place; it's a state of being, right? Where someday all our bodies will be reunited with our souls. How long that takes, when it happens, who knows? He's present in a real way in the tabernacle and the Eucharist, right? Present, like we say philosophically, his essence is there. It's present. Even in the Mass, we say there's different ways that Jesus is present too. So the people gather together. Jesus is there, living there, right? The person of the priest, Jesus is there. The speaking of the Word of God, Jesus is the Word of God, Word made flesh, right? He's present there. So we have to want to say, like, in which way we're talking about, like spiritually, physically, philosophically, theologically, in multiple ways. So, like, for instance, when we say something like God is present everywhere, that's true, but like we wouldn't say that like this table here is God and divine, and we should worship it. But the fact that it exists shows something of God in it, and the fact that God is the source of all being. And even though that table was made by human hands, if you trace the source of that table, it comes from God, the mind of God. And God has human instruments to bring these things into being, right? But everything has something of God in it in the fact that it exists and shows God's presence. But that doesn't mean it actually is a God or God, right? Because we're all of God, but we're not gods or God in that same sense. Good?
Yep.
Okay, excellent. Yeah, I know a lot of kindergartners always ask a question like, they have some deep ones, but they tend to repeat themselves often. Like, why did God make giraffes? Well, God made giraffes to show his love for you. Why did God make space? Well, God made a space so you can wonder and awe at his creation, and it shows his love. Basically, the answer always is he shows his love for you. That's why these things are created. But yeah, they get all these different things, and there's always good questions.
Mhm.
So yeah.
What does glorified body mean other than better than what we got now?
Yeah, so when we talk about the resurrection of the body, that actually is a question that's been debated for centuries, Marilyn. And not just by us, but also by the Greeks too, right? Because the Greeks also believed that there was some kind of bodily nature. Now they had kind of different understanding of like, maybe like where our bodies came from. That the Greeks would believe, especially from Socrates and Plato, that each one has an individual soul that's unique to them. But the stuff that actually makes up that soul, that comes from this primordial matter, right? So it's like the stuff that everything comes from, and the soul actually gives definition of this stuff. So if your body were to decay, and okay, well that just becomes other stuff, right? A flower, or a new soul takes on that stuff to show it what its presence, right? We have an understanding of, based on the coming of Jesus and our understanding of theology through the Jewish tradition, that the body has a dignity itself. That even when someone dies, that body, because it's made in the image and likeness of God, still has a dignity. So I say all that to get to the point, well, that means our bodies will be reunited with our soul someday because of that dignity of the human being. So what will that look like? Well, some theologians, like Thomas Aquinas, posited that the body that you have in heaven will be your 33-year-old body. And the reason he puts that forward is because, well, Jesus died at 33, and so your body wouldn't necessarily take any different form or follow Jesus, right? So your 33-year-old body is the body you're going to have in heaven. Some theologians posit that the body you have in heaven will bear the sacrifices of earth, right? So just as Jesus had his wounds of his crucifixion, his sacrifice for us, our bodies, especially for martyred, would actually show those external signs of that sacrifice for God, right? Some people deposit that it actually may be your 21-year-old body, right? The ones that your vigor of youth, right? That basically we don't know, but all we do know is that our bodies will be united with our souls in heaven, and then they'll be glorified by the presence of God, not really by anything we can do for ourselves, right? The fact that we're actually one with Him in heaven glorifies the body just because of the nature of God and His divinity. So I think that's probably a good way of putting it, but exactly, are you going to be, 2% body fat with, ripped muscles? Maybe. I don't know. Could be. I have no idea, right? I guess we'll find out.
Do the angels have a glorified body?
Angels don't have bodies,
They don't have that,
right? Angels, just like God, are pure spirit.
although we picture them as...
Well, so that doesn't necessarily, well, see, that's the thing. That doesn't mean that the angels can't necessarily manifest themselves to look like us in some way, right? But we wouldn't be able to, touch an angel, right? Because they don't have a body. We could perceive an angel and say, oh, well, that looks like a human. And even in books of Ezekiel, Revelation, Daniel, there are certain angels that kind of have a human-esque shape or human-esque features. But also there's a lot of hideousness when it comes to, and horrifyingness when it comes to angels
They
too.
have faces.
Well, I believe it's in Ezekiel. He talks about the seraphim, and the seraphim have 3 wings, 2 wings covering their legs, 2 wings covering their bodies, and they have feet like a human and a face like a human, and they have also wings that allow them to fly. So they're so in that respect, there's a human-esque face that's perceived at least by Ezekiel, and also in Daniel, even John and Revelation. So there seems to be something to that. But they don't have a face you can actually touch and feel and kiss, for instance, right? When he talks about the cherubim, we look at cherubim as these little babies, right? Well, that was never specified in the Bible. The cherubim are actually pretty horrifying. It talks about a wheel of eyes of the cherubim. They're kind of they rotate, back and forth, and it's just and the eye is very important because what it means is it's knowing everything. You can actually see all things, right? And so the eye is kind of a metaphor for divine knowledge. But to see a wheel of eyes, that'd be kind of. I think most people kind of freak out by that. I would imagine. I know I would. So the description of the angels, we also understand too. A lot of these come through dreams or visions or in some spiritual state, and they're perceived by human senses, which again may not necessarily perceive the spiritual aspects of these things. So we always have to take it with a grain of salt, right? Gabriel, Raphael, Michael, the archangels, we depict them as human beings because we don't really know otherwise how they look. I mean, when Gabriel appealed to Mary, some artist depiction just like Gabriel's like this beam of light, right? And that may be the case. We just don't really know for sure. But maybe, I mean, they may have some. But can they appear to us as like humans? Sure, they can appear to us in any way they really deem fit, and they can do that because they don't have bodies. So it's very reasonable that Gabriel may have appeared to Mary as a human, so it didn't freak her out, right? Or like Raphael, coming to Tobit as a human being because they want to freak him out, right? Or Tobit. So, depictions of angels are usually kind of interpretations, and we always will be very cautious about saying that's actually how he looks like, right? Because we really don't know at all. Thomas Aquinas has a lot on that. He's called the angelic doctor for a reason. He's probably the foremost expert when it comes to that.
So we shouldn't jump to the conclusion that the angel looks like a vision.
Yeah, I mean, I don't necessarily think it's wrong to think that. It's just that we don't know for sure. I don't think we make that conclusion. And part of that is really just the mystery, right? There's certain things on this earth we're not really meant to know. And that's not to say we won't find out someday. It's just that, when we say, like, how does God become enter into this bread and wine to actually become the essence of God as appearing as bread and wine? I don't know. Nobody knows, except for God and the angels probably. But we know sacramentally it happens, and it truly becomes God because, well, God said so. But how that manifests, like, what scientific method can we take to actually see how that happens? Well, we can't, because science has a limit too, just as artistic interpretation has a limit based on the human capacity. So, is it possible to take these abstract things and to present them in a human way that we can understand them? Yeah. Do we do that? Can we do that perfectly? No. I would say not. Because we have limitations of our senses too.
We've talked previously about the consecrated host being tested and finding human heart tissue, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah. Has the consecrated wine ever been tested?
No. Mostly because when the hosts are tested, there's something that manifests itself in the host that deems certain more scrutiny. Typically with the precious blood, it's consumed completely. So oftentimes when we have these Eucharistic miracles, what happens is a host is dropped or something happens during the consecration of the host that there's like blood or there's some kind of, actual physical change to it, which is like, well, what is that, right? And a lot of these things have only been happening over the last maybe, 50 years, right, with scientific developments, that kind of thing. But the precious blood's never really been touched just because, well, it's usually consumed, right, by the time when these things happen. I suppose you could have maybe, if you had some spilt, and take a purificator, but also then it kind of evaporates. So no. So the short answer is no. But the reason that is for those reasons that, well, usually it's never. You put the Eucharist back in the tabernacle. You don't put the wine back in the tabernacle. So that's kind of how it goes. Another question: are we as Catholics allowed to believe in alien life form? Not being funny, but my background in biology leads me to believe it's possible. My belief in God is we're created in His likeness, and therefore, why would He create something other than us humans? So yeah, there's nothing in our faith that would say you can't believe that there's other life forms out there. We would probably say that the likelihood is very, very small, just as the likelihood of us actually being alive here on this planet is very, very small. There has to be an act of a divine presence to actually kind of even allow for that. I believe it's Father Robert Spitzer in his book. He says something that the odds of life being on this planet was like 10 to the 100th to the 100th. And so if you were to write out those zeros, the one out of all those, over one all those zeros, it would take an entire lifetime to actually complete the page of writing out all the zeros. So it's a very, very minuscule chance that life even happened here. Now that's not to say it can't happen in the expanding large universe. And I think Father Spitzer would say that's true too. But we also have to recognize that Jesus would have died for them. And the fact there would be alien life forms, the big question would be then, is it rational? Are they rational life forms? That would make the distinction between animals and us, that we have this gift of rationality, intellect. That's a gift from God. We can't really explain how that happens. Okay, maybe there's a capacity in the biology of us that has the capacity for intellect, that we maybe grow over time in evolution. But even evolution biology cannot actually answer the question is, where does our intellect come from? And so we would say philosophically, theologically, well, obviously that had to be a gift from God. And God works within human ways, within natural ways, for that to develop. Which is also why we can say even evolution could be something that a Catholic could actually say, yeah, that's a very viable way of saying God was there. But we still have to say that God was present in all those moments to bring about that intellect, bring about these beings. So same thing with alien life form. That, well, okay, are they given the gift of rationale? Which, okay, well, that means that they're made in the image and likeness of God too. And so therefore, Jesus would have died for them as well. And so we should, if there is a life out there and we're seeking for it, and praise God we are, we can also trust that our faith would not be negated by the fact there would be another life form out in the universe somewhere. All it really could do is add to it, right? And show the greater glory of God, and actually open up more avenues of charity and love and the tenets of our faith with other beings. So good. So yeah, it's a good question, and I think I think it's something we could always keep those questions open mind to these things. Never doubt, but always be questioning. And I think that's really the basic: is, are they rational creatures? And if they are, they're made in the image and likeness of God, and therefore they deserve respect, dignity, and the virtues that we foster in our faith, and also recognize that Christ died for them as well. So it's always important to make that very clear in that question.
Sometimes we see in an obituary somebody who we know was raised a Catholic, and there's no mention of a funeral mass or a memorial mass. Maybe there's a celebration of life in some secular place like a vestment. Is it possible that there could be a private funeral mass?
Yeah, of course. When it comes to those things, it's always at the discretion of the family. I will say that there's been times where instead of having it mass at church, we'd have a service at the funeral parlor, which is just like family only. I've been to a few of those. The other thing too to keep in mind too is that the funeral liturgy is really for the living, not for the dead. The dead, they've already either received their reward or not. Exactly.
Because they might be in prison.
Right, but also the other aspect of the funeral liturgy is actually supposed to bring comfort and consolation to the living. So it's very possible that you can still pray for the deceased without going through the funeral liturgy, of course. But the funeral liturgy is directed towards that closure, ultimately, for the living. To really say, okay, look, Grandma's not here anymore. He's not living on this earth, and we can mourn that. But also we hope and trust that we'll see Grandma again and be united with her in the life to come, right? That's really the whole point of the funeral liturgy. So, unfortunately, I think we're in a society today that doesn't value that as much, nor does it really value faith. And so I can't say in every situation that they're having a private liturgy or having what we call a parlor service, or but I would imagine there's at least some kind of act of prayer going on with a lot of them. Yeah, because our rites are Christian burial, not Catholic burial. So in other words, we can have the rite for a Lutheran or an Anglican or any baptized person. Doesn't necessarily be a mass, which is why a deacon can also perform those rites too. So that happens. It happens quite often. Actually, I would say it's probably happening more often than not now. We're having more parlor service, I think, than actually masses.
Because of COVID.
I don't know. I think it was even before COVID, though. I think COVID was a big reason. I know I've been a lot more during COVID. We're doing a lot more just internments, like what we call committals. And the idea would be a moral mass later, but you don't have to do the moral mass either. So I think there's just been more, maybe, I wouldn't say secularized, but maybe more people have been maybe opting not to do the funeral rites for whatever reason. And to tell you the truth, there's not even an ordained minister who can do anyone can really do the funeral rites as far as committal, commendation, or even like a ceremony. There are certain rites that can only be done by a deacon or priest within there, but a layperson can actually do the funeral rites too. And so maybe people are opting to do that. I don't know. I really don't know. But yeah, I also know there's some families say, well, mom or grandma would have wanted this. And so even though they may not want it, maybe they're not practicing their faith, they still recognize, well, this is something that the deceased wanted. And I kind of push back on that a little bit, because my thought is, well, that's good. I'm glad she wanted that, and we should honor her choices. But I look at this opportunity to maybe engage them in their faith and evangelize too. Because I think that's really the more important thing. It's like, well, hey, your mom had a great faith. So how are you doing on that? Right? I think that tends to maybe get people kind of thinking about it more. And I think that's happening. I mean, weddings, funerals, baptisms, those kind of have an effect on people to re-engage in some way.
I thought until just a few years ago that a funeral mass could only be said for a Catholic, but that's not true.
Yeah. Well, memorial mass can be said for anybody.
Well, even the funeral, like a person whose spouse was non-Catholic.
Yeah.
Wanted their spouse
Yep.
to have a funeral mass, and there was no problem with that.
Yep.
And I thought there would have been.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. So, like you're saying, if let's say a Catholic spouse had a non-Catholic, and the non-Catholic died, they would have.
Right.
Yeah, that's no problem.
It never occurred to me.
Yeah. As a matter of fact, the mass can. I mean, it's interesting for like weddings too. Like sometimes the rite allows for like weddings without mass, just as there's funerals without mass. And primarily, I think what the Holy Mother, what the Church envisions is if you have a non-Catholic and a Catholic, or even a non-Christian and a Catholic, right? That it may be a little bit exclusive to have a mass and distribute communion, especially when half the congregation can't. So there are certain specifics and certain circumstances where that would be warranted and probably even preferred. So same with funerals though too. So it's probably better, especially if you have a non-Catholic, to not do the mass, just because, well, if nobody's going to receive communion, it's probably better just to do the funeral rite and call it good. Well, that's discerned really up front with the family and the priest and whoever's going to be doing it. So we actually had a lot of discussion about. You're welcome. We had a lot of discussion about, especially with words of remembrance. That's been a big hot button issue. We talked about our religion committee, and Marilyn was there last night. And I tell you, I'm really leaning more towards not having it at the mass anymore. Just because the last 3 funerals I've had completely disregarded the direction I gave. And so part of it, I think, is a catharsis for the mourners, which is fine, but there's other ways you can do that. And that's why I always kind of say, well, if you guys want to, if you're, at the vigil, at the funeral parlor, just with the family, anyone can say whatever they want. There's actually time. It actually specifies that in the rite. People come and say whatever they want. It's okay, right? And if you want to get stuff off your chest, fine. You know, it should be appropriately, hopefully, right? Whereas if now the rite does allow for the mass too, but the mass is, you know, there has to be appropriateness involved. You have to be kind of respectful about other people's time. I mean, because a lot of people come to the funeral, they're missing work. They're maybe taking some time off to do that, to go and plan to go back to work. Especially if you have like the burial at Jefferson Barracks, you can't be riffing off and going off, you know, over time, because you get out there, you gotta get out there when they want you out there. And if you don't get out there in time, may not be burying grandma that day. So I always want to be very clear with that, just because my direction usually is no more than 2 people, no more than 10 minutes total. And the last 3 times that's been kind of abused. So I'm with the mindset, you know what? Let's do it at the wake. You can do it at the reception, all you want. Even if you want to do it if you want to do it at the committal, fine. After the committal sermon, fine. But I'm moving way towards doing it at the mass, I think, just because of my experience so far. Unfortunately, I mean, you know, that's just how it goes.
The rep warrant actually told people at one single mass that I'm aware of that we don't do that. You know, this,
Well, I will say there was a family who remained nameless. One of their members of the family died, and you know, the first time I met them, I said, okay, here's what I gave my spiel, and said, okay, well, you know, for the eulogy or the words of remembrance, you know, 10 minutes, 2 people, fine. Well, of course they abused. They had 3 people come up, and it lasted 25 minutes instead of 15 or whatever, 10. So the next time someone else passed, and they came to me and said, oh yeah, well, we can do the words of remembrance at the vigil. And they said, oh, well, can that be in the mass somewhere? Oh no, we don't do that. Now, I wasn't lying, right? But also it's one of these things where I remember what happened last time, and I'm not going to have that abuse again. So if you want to do the vigil, that'd be the proper time, and that's what happened. They did the visitation, it worked out fine, worked out perfectly.
I was at a funeral mass in California, and so the priest, you know, did the mass and was all fun, so he left, and then the eulogist came up, and I think 2 or 3 people came up, so that's another way to do it.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, so when that happens too, a lot of times the rite actually has specified times when that should happen, like within the liturgy. But yeah, I mean, I think there's nothing wrong with actually leaving, like, hey, let's end the mass. Let's take our brother and sister to a place of rest. Hey, if you want to, as long as you don't have to be at the funeral, the committal place, yeah, if you want to go up there now, go for it, right? Or before mass starts, fine, come on up, whatever. But I think a lot of it is just, part of it I think is catharsis. The other thing is to also maybe just be seen in a way sometimes. There's a little bit of pride involved with that. Because part of it is, well, why don't you say this for your family? And usually the response is, well, I want everyone to hear this. Okay. Well, why? You know, is this really something that's deep and impactful, that is saying something about this person's life that's really uplifting and kind of inspiring? Or is it just a way for you to kind of work your own stuff out in a group? I think there may be a little bit of both and in that. I don't know. I would hate to categorize anybody, but I think there may be something to that.
So it could be, for that individual, it could be part of group therapy.
Right. Right, which is not, that's not what it's about. And that's the thing, this is not about that. And you guys probably heard, you know, also eulogies or words of remembrance are meant to be something inspired about the faith life of the person, right? The good deeds of that person, like how that the person, how that exemplified Christ to each other, or in a human way was able to relate to other people. In some ways, the homily is like that too. But you know, it's not about our fishing trip where we got, you know, drunk and had a great time, or you know how you know, grandma, she loved to gamble and she lost all the money on. Okay, how's that beneficial? You know. Yeah, so I don't know. It's a constant discernment debate, and it's I think it's done imperfectly most times. I've heard some really good. I've heard some really good words of redemption, really excellent. And I've heard a lot that have not been. And so, yeah, that's kind of why I'm leaning that way. But we'll see. I might change my mind. Who knows? I'm known to do that.
Kind of from what you say, it's like people's misunderstanding about what it's all about, and it takes a while to develop that understanding, not just between the time the person dies and their funeral.
Yeah. Well, that's another point too. I think when you're looking at these things, the preparation time, from the time someone dies to the time we actually have a funeral, on average, about a week. And that's why I'm always very cognizant when I meet with families. Like when we go over like stuff that I tell them I don't need an answer now. Take this home and pray with it, think about it, and get back to me. Like what readings you want to use. I don't need to know that right now. If you want to take some time and think about it, great. Who's going to be the ministers? I don't even know that at all. I just need to know you have somebody. And if I need to go get someone, I'll do that. But all I really know from you is if you have someone available. Because I think you're right. In some ways, that's not a lot of time to kind of put all that together, where you're trying to mourn, you're trying to get all this stuff ready, you're trying to get all the more practical things in order. It can be overwhelming. Which I think that's, in some ways in our society, we've really diminished the act of mourning. And we've almost kind of the point where we've kind of driven it away from our society completely. Like, mourning is looked on as a negative in life, right? That, we can't do that. We don't want to think about the loss. We don't want to grapple with what's going on inside, or our thoughts about how this impacts us. Like when I was working for Boeing, one thing that kind of was interesting to me is I didn't really think about it at the time, but when I started seeing it practically, it seemed kind of cruel that we never had bereavement leave. Like if someone died, you had to take vacation leave or sick leave, and it was always kind of funny because but even if even most companies have bereavement leave, it's like a day or 2 days, 3 maybe at the most. And is that really enough time to mourn someone? If you've lost your husband or your wife, or God forbid a child, 3 days, that's it? Get back to work? But I think that's kind of a function of our society that kind of diminishes that aspect of our lives. That we don't want to look at the time, that reminds us so much of our mortality. We don't want to think about that. Let's move on. Let's just try to occupy our time as much as possible so we don't have to think about it. Whereas 100 years ago, they was kind of celebrated. Most people today maybe die in a hospital bed or, wherever else. People back then were dying in their own beds, surrounded by their family. You would lay people out in the living room and actually kind of have like an actual liturgy and a celebration and a wake and do all these things that kind of let us let go and mourn properly. And sometimes last for days. And today it doesn't happen. I think we kind of lost something there. I don't know. That's just me. Well, good. It is after 8. But if anyone has any other questions, want to stick around, you're more than welcome. Otherwise, thank you for coming. I don't know about next week. I know they're having Women at the Well, correct?
Yeah.
So I don't know why they have to choose my night, but okay, that's fine. We'll I make a determination we're going to meet next week or not because of that. Maybe just have a guys' night. Just have a guys' night with everyone there. Maybe we'll just do it and just have the guys. That'll be good. Of course, if you're not going to Women Well, you're always welcome to. We don't discriminate on that kind of thing, even though they do. That's okay. So great. We'll have next week, same time, same place. And thanks for coming, guys. Good to see you.
Thanks, Father.
See you guys online. Have a good night.